the people and the cultures that have made St. Louis what it is today. We'll have that story next on City Corner. I'm Steve Potter and welcome to City Corner. Ethnic St. Louis is a new book that really shows a spotlight on the roots, really, of St. Louis and its culture. We want to welcome the authors of the book who are with us today. To my right, that's Patrick McCarthy. Also here is Elizabeth Terry and John Wright. Welcome to the program, all of you.
Thank you.
And a fascinating, interesting book. And you know, I knew that St. Louis, like many large cities, is a big melting pot. I guess I didn't realize how big a pot it really was as far as all the different cultures that have called St. Louis home over the years. And John, this book was originally your idea. How did all this happen?
Well, I received a call from Darlene Green, City Comptroller, and said she thought something should be done for the 250th anniversary for the city. So we're a little behind on getting it out, but I mentioned the publisher I'd worked with, and Josh Stevens at Reedy Press, and then he knew Elizabeth, whom I had known, but I didn't know she had a relationship with Reedy Press, and then he pulled in Patrick, so we all three of us worked on it together.
Okay, John, I think you've written something like 13 books of Missouri history, one way or the other?
17.
17. I didn't want to slight you there.
That's okay, that's okay, that's okay. With the church and community. Most of it regards the African-American community.
Uh-huh. And Elizabeth, tell me a little bit about your background. I know that I think you wrote a book on the Faus family here in St. Louis, among other things.
I did. It's called Oysters to Angus. It's a timeline of the Faust family. You know, Tony Faust had that great oyster restaurant downtown, German restaurant, all the way down to Faust Park. And so it's set in the context of German St. Louis history.
Mm-hmm. And Patrick, you're particularly interested in the Bosnian community here in St. Louis.
Yeah.
I think you co-authored a book on that subject too.
I did. Yeah, I'm an honorary Bosnian, Irish Bosnian. I'm the only one in St. Louis.
Oh yeah? You sure?
Yes.
Is that in the book?
Well, I have worked with the big Bosnian community here for now more than 20 years.
Uh-huh.
And we're one of the largest, if not the largest, Bosnian communities in the country.
The largest, from what I understand, yeah.
The largest. So it's a big part of who we are now, and we're glad to include them in this book.
And I know there's a Bosnian newspaper in St. Louis,
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. Talk a little bit, okay, let me ask you this then. It's true, any big old city would be a melting pot, right? Is St. Louis unique in any way in that regard, any of you? I mean, as far as the diversity, is it unusual?
Well, you know, one of the things we learned in the course of doing the book is from the very beginning, we have been a multi-ethnic city. And you're right, in some ways that's the story of large urban centers in the United States. But St. Louis, and Elizabeth will help me with the date, by the late 19th century, we had the most foreign-born population of any city in the United States. That's something very distinctive about St. Louis. We like to use the term melting pot because it's the one people are familiar with, but that suggests that we all become kind of a homogeneous whole. And we think now a better way of looking at it is very diverse and different groups of people who come together on a common ground but retain something about their unique identity and history.
Uh-huh. And those groups of people, that's kind of shifted from time to time, right? Take the German, for example. I know on my mother's side, they were part of the Saxony migration here in the mid-1850s. So there was a time when Germans dominated the scene as far as immigrants in St. Louis, but that's changed over the years. Different groups, Bosnians now, Germans then, other groups at other times.
It does change. It changed all through the 19th century, and I can speak to that, and these guys can speak more to the 20th century, but it shifts and changes, and it's funny how, you know, at the turn of the 19th century, around 1900, there was a little Syria at 4th and 14th and Papin and Lafayette in that South City area, and those were Lebanese and Syrians and Turks from the Ottoman Empire region. And now the pendulum is swinging again, and here we're talking about Syrians again. So it's coming around.
Yeah, and John, I guess it would be different depending on what group you're talking about, why that particular group came to St. Louis at that particular time. I mean, the different groups had their different reasons, didn't they?
Right. You have variety. You have those because of what's happening in their own country, like the African Americans, they were brought here for labor. You had the Chinese who were kind of pushed out because of racial segregation and oppression in the West. They came to St. Louis, many of them, and many came because of opportunities. They had certain skills we needed, and then they brought others with them.
So the book is divided into sections. There's a section on the Germans or the Bosnians or whatever it might be. And how many groups are there altogether?
Oh, boy.
Dozens,
Yeah.
right?
Dozens, yeah.
At least 80 or so.
It's kind of divided by periods, too. And we start with the early part of the city, founding of the city, and work our way to present day. So you'll find the groups that came first in the first part of the book. Then as others became
So
part
who
of
were
the
the
city.
first immigrants? You know, we think of St. Louis, I guess, as French, but help me with my history, but it was Spanish territory first?
You know, let me correct you. We start
Okay.
the book with Native Americans.
Duh, okay.
And, you know, they were just...
They weren't immigrants.
Oh, yeah.
They were just as immersed in the diverse fabric of the early French St. Louis culture. And they walked the streets as, you know, mostly the Osage, but lots of local tribes. They walked the streets as friends, as neighbors, as fur trading partners, and as slaves. So they were highly immersed in the early French culture that was under Spanish rule. So you see all the diversity.
It's complicated.
Yeah.
But then that harmonious relationship didn't last, did it?
Well, you know, through the, Laclede came and Chouteau came around 1763, and through the 1770s and 1780s, it was a prosperous little village with the fur trade and great relationships with the Osage. But the American Revolution, then now you've got the Americans across the river competing for those fur trading rights with the Indians. And so the Spanish said, all right, forget the fur trade. So that slowed things down. But then, by then, the Osage were starting to succumb to European diseases, and they were weakening with war. So by the time the Americans came across the river with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, that they really lost that power. The Americans wanted to farm, and that's when the Native Americans were pushed westward.
It's a beautiful book, not just with the information, the history, but photographs is a really important element. And there are hundreds, I'm sure, hundreds of photographs, historical photographs that are absolutely beautiful. And why don't we share some of those with our viewers now? And I know there's a story behind every one in the book. The book is Ethnic St. Louis, and it traces all the immigrant groups that have called St. Louis home from day one.
So there we start with the Germans. That's Tony Faus restaurant. It was on the corner of Broadway and Elm. Broadway is still there. Elm Street is no longer there. He was a great example of German culture. You know, most Germans, like Tony Faus, came after the failed revolution of 1848. And that's when this huge wave of German immigrants came to St. Louis, and they brought with them German culture. Beer gardens, right there on top of the restaurant, you see a beer garden, the only one in the West that was on top of a building. And this was part of the issue in St. Louis, was the temperance movement, and beer brewing and beer drinking was part of German culture. So that was some of the issues, and they were met with some discrimination, but it wasn't like the Irish. The Germans had a little more money, they established themselves more quickly, and you've got great iconic German names like Lemp and Bush.
Well, I remember stories from my own family, being my mother's side was German, as I said, and they were fairly prominent. They were business owners and so forth. But there was a time, I'm thinking it was around World War I remember my grandmother telling stories about her father talking about how they were not treated well just because they were German. And, you know, they felt discriminated against, even though, you know, they were business owners and that sort of thing.
Right, and again, the pendulum swings, and by they had settled down. You've got your second generation. They were mostly English speakers. And by World War I, though, that discrimination came back again against the German culture.
Let's look at another image from the book, Ethnic St. Louis.
Those are some teachers from Sumner High School. Sumner was the first high school for African Americans west of the Mississippi. You can tell at that time, teachers did dress according to, and became the role models they wanted their students
They
to
look
be.
very respectable.
They were very respectable, very much involved in the community. Herman Dreer, who's on the front row, second from the left there, started a loan company for those who could not afford loans when white institutions wouldn't give them a loan.
Right.
He ignited Douglas University when African Americans couldn't get into universities. He provided a place for them to go to get higher education. He was a Phi Beta Kappa, although he was not allowed to take part in Wash U or St. Louis U in the Phi Beta Kappa program, although he had one of the top scholars in the country.
Imagine how frustrating that would be, to be someone with that intellect and accomplishments, but yet held back. I guess they accepted it, though, at the time.
Well, you do, and you go on and do other things. He used his skills to develop a university for African American students. He used his skills to write. He wrote plays. He was also a minister. So he used his skills in the community.
Let's look at some more images from the book.
Those are Ethiopians.
Eritreans.
Eritreans, rather.
Part of Ethiopia's civil war that split the two, and Eritrea became its own country. One of the really significant newer communities here in St. Louis are refugees who came from the war in Eritrea and have become integrated, well integrated into the community here in St. Louis.
And there's a movement here, isn't there, in St. Louis to welcome refugees from other countries? I've seen that with Bosnians. I mean, there's an actual effort to make it happen.
Right. I mean, there are very pragmatic reasons for that. We know that immigrants and refugees are an important driver of economic growth and development. Just take a look at the population of the city of St. Louis. We've gone from 900,000 to just over 300,000.
We were the third or fourth biggest city in the United States at one time, weren't we?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what paralleled that relative size was the number of people who had come from other places. So we like to say when we do the presentation, there's a little bit of an advocacy component where we say we built the city of St. Louis with people who came from other places. One of the ways that we can rebuild the city of St. Louis is to welcome and invite those who have come from other places.
Is there much resistance to that these days? People, afraid of people that aren't from here?
There is some. I think, we certainly know in the political world there are very, very strong voices against the idea of bringing in refugees.
But I promise we won't discuss politics on this show.
All right.
There's enough of that, isn't there?
There is, and I think we have to just look at that and unpack some of the fears. We look at the Bosnian community as an example, primarily Muslims who came. That's attached to a lot of the fear and concern right now. And we can say we've had a very, very good history and very good involvement with the Bosnians.
We need to take a break, and we've got some more great images from the book we want to share with our viewers when we come back. So Ethnic St. Louis, we'll pick up on that right after this.
So, same time next week?
Well, of course. Put away a few bucks, feel like $1 million. For free tips to help you save, go to Feed the Pig.
The odds of this daughter of a clergyman spending 11 weeks at #1 on the U.S. singles charts? 1 in 19 million. The odds of going on to win 6 Grammy Awards? 1 in 1.4 million. The odds of having a child diagnosed with autism? 1 in 110. I'm Toni Braxton, and I encourage you to learn the signs of autism at autismspeaks.org.
I'm Steve Potter. Welcome back to City Corner. And today we're talking about the new book, Ethnic St. Louis. It really traces the people and the cultures that have made St. Louis what it is today, from the beginning until now. And our guests to my immediate right are the co-authors of the book. We have Patrick McCarthy, Elizabeth Terry, and John Wright. And the book is filled with beautiful photographs. Was that, where'd they all come from? Everywhere?
A little bit of every place. Some community contributed, some we took ourselves, some from historic sources like the Missouri History Museum, so a variety of different places.
And really the bottom line of the book shows the positive things that people from other cultures can contribute to one community.
Right.
And
we concentrate on the positive.
Right.
It's a celebration. It's real. It's an honest look at these communities, but it's a celebration of what they've given to St. Louis.
Let's go back and look at more images from the book, Ethnic St. Louis. Each one has a fascinating story behind it, and our guests can comment about that.
That's the African Arts Festival in Forest Park that takes place Memorial Day weekend every year.
That represents the Irish community. The Irish, a huge wave of them came after the economic despair in Ireland in the 1840s. And by 1850, 43% of St. Louisans were either born in Ireland or born in Germany. By 1860, St. Louis was the most foreign-born city in the country. So the Irish faced tough discrimination.
I was just going to say that. They went through a period of that too.
It was far more difficult for them than the Germans, and no one wanted the Irish to live in their neighborhood, so they squatted in the near north, which is now what we call the Kerry Patch. It was called that then, and they sustained themselves. No one would hire them, and so they built support businesses, and St. Lawrence O'Toole was the pride of the patch, beautiful churches, and out of the patch came some really great St. Louisans. One that we know today is Cardinal Glennon. The Children's Hospital on South Grand was named after Cardinal Glennon.
Let's go to the next image.
Oh, that's the taken at the annual powwow for Washington University each year. Native Americans come to St. Louis to celebrate their heritage, and that's one of the dancers there. You find a whole variety of things going on that weekend. So every year in the spring. So I would encourage your listeners to take part of the enjoyment. They can't take part in the dancing, but they can take part in the enjoyment. As a young man.
They won't let me dance like that? I was going to go.
You got to get the feathers first.
Okay. Who's this gentleman?
This is a Bosnian, one of many, one of the approximately 50,000 who now live in St. Louis. I love that strong Slavic face, and we have, in addition to the Bosnians, other communities from the former Yugoslavia, Serbs, Croats, who have been in St. Louis for a long, long time. Bosnians are more recent arrivals. They came in the early 1990s as a result of the war and the breakup of Yugoslavia.
I did a radio interview a few years ago with, I don't remember the gentleman's name, the editor of the Bosnian newspaper, and with Angelina Jolie, who did a movie related to that, and of course the title of it
In the
escapes
Land
me.
of Blood and Honey.
There you go.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, and Shukria Djijovic is the editor of the Saba newspaper.
Right. I had a fascinating interview with both of them about that. Let's look at another image from the book, Ethnic St. Louis. Well, that takes you back.
Yes, yes. The Jewish community is very important. They came all through the 1800s and established synagogues and temples and cemeteries throughout St. Louis, but really most came 1880s through 1900, and a lot of them came from Eastern Europe. They met heavy discrimination in housing and employment and recreation. All of that is documented. So what they did is they built organizations and social clubs and groups so that they could form cohesiveness and help themselves. And what that did is it helped unite Jewish St. Louisans because they came from around the world. Different cultures, different languages, different traditions. And some of those organizations stand today, the Jewish Federation and also the J, the Jewish Community Center.
Right.
We know it as the J in Creve Coeur.
Maybe this is too broad of a question, but any comment, like if there's a particular group that was discriminated at some point in history, did they go on maybe to find someone to discriminate against too later? Do you see any pattern of that? Or does a group learn from being the victim and they don't do it to another group?
We haven't learned because everyone except the Native American is an immigrant.
Right.
And so we can tell by the conventions that are going on, that are being held. We have a lot of people who want to discriminate against those who are here.
But I'd say a lesson of this book is that's silly.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Let's look at some more images.
Singleton Palmer. St. Louis was a great jazz place. and we have Louis Armstrong came up here sometimes to play. We have W.C. Handy with the St. Louis Blues.
Right.
And so we used to have Gaslight Square. Singleton Palmer was a regular on Gaslight Square with Dixieland music. And so that tradition continues in I guess you'd say a mild sort of way. We have now the Blues Center downtown.
Right, the Blues Museum.
National Blues Museum, yes.
Uh-huh.
So we are carrying on that celebration today in St. Louis. Hopefully we'll attract, they're hoping to attract thousands of visitors across the country to the museum.
I was down there right when it hadn't opened yet. I haven't been there since it's finished, but it's quite a facility. Right. Ethnic St. Louis is the book, and we have some more images. Who are these young people?
These are members of the Croatian community. So I mentioned that Croatians were South Slavs who came to this area beginning at the end of the 19th century. Actually, a connection with the Jewish community. Their first church was in a former synagogue at 8th and Shoto. The building doesn't exist anymore, but they moved their church to 12th and Russell across from McGurk's, and it's St. Joseph's Croatian Catholic Church. It's been there for over 100 years. And they've welcomed new immigrants, new refugees who came from Bosnia. The Catholics who are from Bosnia then are part of that community at St. Joseph's.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to the next one.
Yes, the Lebanese and Syrians really form a foundation of St. Louis. And I mentioned earlier they came from the Ottoman Empire. And once they got here, and they were discriminated against and marginalized. But once they got here, they, as opposed to the homogenous nature of the Ottoman Empire, they found their footing in their own ethnicity once they arrived in St. Louis. And it was a struggle to find employment. Many of them were known as peddlers. But the Lebanese really rose up out of that, and we see that tradition today in St. Raymond's Church.
Let's go to the next one.
Sumner High School. That's one of the after-school activities. You'll notice they're playing golf. One of the things about Sumner High School, because of the large number of students concentrated during the time of segregation, we only had 2 high schools for the most part of St. Louis, and a third for vocational training. Sumner was able to offer more academic and extracurricular activities than many of the white high schools that were smaller, because it's by numbers you can do more. And so by going to Sumner High School, you had many more opportunities.
And there are quite a few people's names that we know today that went to Sumner, aren't there?
Correct, yes.
Yeah.
There are a whole lot of...
A lot.
A lot. It's supposed to have the largest alumni of any high school in the country because it goes back to 1875.
Did any of you learn anything from writing this book? I mean, something that surprised you?
One of the things I learned is, we talked earlier about this, is what happens to a community when you have so many people who come from different places? And I think we have a choice about how to look at that. Is that a strength? And I think it is. There's real strength in the diversity that we have in St. Louis. Rather than it being a challenge, we see there are challenges. People face discrimination when they first come, but it helps build us into a more cohesive, a more dynamic community. And I would say that's something that was certainly reinforced.
You know, when I was growing up, I was always fascinated and liked the exchange students, because I always found other cultures, like, I never felt threatened or anything by it. I always thought it was interesting.
Right. Yes. I agree.
Yeah.
And that what they did is all these immigrant groups historically laid the foundation for the St. Louis that we enjoy today. St. Louis wouldn't be the way it is in all of the great diversity without those early founders and the struggles that they went through.
I think most residents don't realize the vast number of ethnic groups we have in St. Louis. With this book,
I didn't realize that, John, until I went through the book and looked at all the different categories.
yeah, I mean, I went to the festivals and celebrations, taking pictures, and I didn't know all these groups had annual events and celebrations and activities, and they are all welcoming to me as a visitor.
In the few minutes left, let's look as many more images from the book as we can. Ethnic St. Louis is the book from Reedy Press.
This is someone from the, I believe, the Indian community here in St. Louis. Might be Pakistan, I'm sorry. So it represents another of the significant communities, South Asian communities that have come to St. Louis. And again, I think represents the variety and diversity we have in St. Louis.
Let's look at one more image.
Those are teachers at Simmons Elementary School in St. Louis. The gentleman is in the midst of all the ladies was principal, Richard Cole. He was also a minister of Fifth Baptist Church. He served as an administrator in the city schools for over 50 years. That's hard to do in these days with all the turmoil. But you notice the frame, the wood frame. Simmons was the oldest standing elementary school on the same site before it was closed in St. Louis. It went from frame to a few rooms, then a big, larger facility, but it's closed now. Most of the schools in the Ville neighborhood are closed because we don't have the students.
Right. And Elizabeth, as a lady, aren't you glad you don't have to wear all those clothes?
Yes.
That's
yes,
a
I
lot of
am,
layers
but-
of clothes they
That's
wore
right.
back then. Hey, sort of to wrap things up, what's the story? You say we're making an attempt to attract more immigrants. So is that the good news that we are?
I think it is. John can say more about it, but there's an organized effort through the Mosaic Project to attract immigrants, refugees to come to St. Louis for all the practical reasons we've already talked about.
Just a couple seconds left. Any closing thoughts?
What I think we have to learn to live together. And I think that's the biggest difficulty we face. Learn to accept each other and value each other for each other. Each of us bring a contribution to the city.
Elizabeth?
Let's celebrate the diversity.
Well, we will. Ethnic St. Louis is the book. We've been talking to John Wright, Elizabeth Terry, and Patrick McCarthy. It's from Reedy Press. We'll have some contact information go up. It's a great book full of wonderful words and beautiful pictures. Elizabeth Terry, John Wright, Patrick McCarthy, thank you all for being here, and thank you for what you've done.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you.
I'm Steve Potter. That's all the time we have for this edition of City Corner. Thank you for watching, and I hope you'll see us next time. Bye-bye.